Welcome to the Human Together podcast, a show that is centered on humanity to create understanding and appreciation for individuals and groups that are both informative and thought-provoking. Today I will be talking about a very inspirational person, Blessed Stanley Rother. I will start with a cursory glance at the life of Stanley Rother by reading a short little biography provided by Little Black Book 6-Minute Meditation. On March 13, 2017, the Vatican announced plans to beatify the first United States-born man. Stanley Rother was born March 27, 1935, on a farm in Okarche, Oklahoma. While in high school, he entered Assumption Seminary in San Antonio, Texas, but he was asked to leave since he struggled with Latin and had poor grades. With his bishop's help, Stanley received a second chance at priesthood and was sent to Mount St. Mary's Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland. He was ordained in 1963 for the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and Tulsa. After 5 years as an associate pastor, Father Rother asked to serve as the diocese mission in Guatemala. Father Rother quickly assimilated to his new life, learning the native languages and choosing to live in poverty with the Indian tribes. He taught the people simple farming techniques so they could grow their own food and helped them build an irrigation system. Civil war broke out in Guatemala while Father Rother was there. An estimated 200,000 people were killed between 1960 and 1996. Catholic catechists disappeared and people sought sanctuary in churches. Soon, Father Rother's name appeared on the death list. He returned to Oklahoma for 2 months before deciding to celebrate Holy Week in Guatemala. On July 28, 1981, 3 men entered his rectory and executed the 46-year-old priest. Father Rother was beatified on September 23, 2017. That gives you a baseline understanding about the life of Stanley Rother, but I want you to learn and understand much more about the life of Stanley Rother. To help with this goal of understanding, I've invited George Rigazzi, who is the archivist for the Oklahoma City Archdiocese. He is well versed in the life of Stanley Rother and has given many lectures during his term as an archivist. George is a person who I consider to have encyclopedic knowledge. Without further ado, I welcome George Rigazzi to the show. My first question is, give me a short biography of Stanley Rother to give my listeners some background about him.
Well, Father Stan was a farmer. His family was from Okarche, about 35 miles north of here, a little German community. He was one of 4 children. He was the first, born in 1935. He was baptized in 1935 by Monsignor Staber, who was the pastor of Okarche at the time, and as one historian stated, the absolute dictator of Okarche from 1903 to 1948. And he wanted Stan Rother to be, his name was Stanley Francis Rother on the birth certificate, and Monsignor Staber wanted him baptized Francis Stanley Rother because he thought that was a better saint name than Stanley. I don't think wrong with Stanislaus, but I guess he had a problem with it. So he was baptized Francis Stanley Rother. And matter of fact, when I was doing some cataloging of Father Stan's effects of his books, he worked in the bookbindery at Assumption Seminary in San Antonio. And on the outside of it, it had F. Stanley Rother, that he had engraved himself on it. So yeah, he went by what Monsignor Staber said. As a child, he was a normal kid. He had an honorary streak from what Sister Marita, his blood sister, said. But, was a nice kid, kind of a quiet guy, always was president of the Future Farmers of America, and his parents really had no inkling he wanted to be a priest. And at a family dinner, after they were finished eating every night, they would move the chairs back, kneel down and pray the rosary. Well, after they prayed the rosary, he announced to the family he wanted to go to the seminary. And then his sister Betty announced she wanted to go and be a nun. And so for the Adorers in Wichita, which ran the school at Okarche, which was a remarkable order because in the middle 50s, there were 52 women from Okarche that joined that order. We're talking about 1,300 people, right? So 52 women became sisters of that community.
That's pretty remarkable.
It is remarkable. It was and even today, it's still about that same size. And there's 350 families at the parish at Okarche. So it's definitely a Catholic community, kind of a rare thing in Oklahoma. Closest thing would probably be Krebs and down by McAllister, or the Italian community. He grew up in that environment, decided and he went to seminary, and he had a rough time. He went to St. John's Prep in San Antonio, which is a college seminary. Latin, he could not stand, and he had a hard time with it. It just wasn't thinking in, and everything in that time it was in Latin. His classes were in Latin, his textbooks, and of course the Mass that he had to learn was going to be in Latin. So it's kind of critical that he learned it. Well, he struggled through 4 years. His first year in theology at Assumption in San Antonio, he was asked to leave because his grades were so low. He then came back to Oklahoma, and through the guidance of Bishop Reed and Monsignor Lukey, who was Vicar General and Vocation Director, they found a place for him at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. They accepted him as seminary, and he got through the rest of his schooling. Latin still was not his favorite thing in the world. And when he was ordained, he first went to St. William's in Durant, because remember at that time the whole state was the diocese. It was Diocese of Oklahoma City and Tulsa. While he was in Durant, he helped build the cabins at Lake Texoma the diocese still uses to this day.
I've stayed in those, yes.
Have you really?
Yes.
I've never been down there before. I need to go look at them because
really
somebody
nice. Right on the water.
Yeah, he did all that. Usually, most of it was World War II surplus that he just kind of cobbled together. And so he did that during the week while he was serving in Durant. He also went and finished up his bachelor's degree at Southeastern while he was at St. William. And he was in Tulsa to get a couple different parishes, St. Francis Xavier, the cathedral, and then his last assignment before he went to the mission in 1968 was Corpus Christi here in Oklahoma City. Now the mission was just in its infancy. It was like 4 years old at the time that we'd been involved with it. The actual mission itself was 400 years old. But Oklahoma got involved in 1964. At one point, 6 priests off and on from Oklahoma. And he was perfect for missionary work because he could fix anything. He could build anything. He was a farmer. You know, he had a lot of self-doubt because of what had happened in seminary about his abilities. When he got down there, the guy who couldn't hack Latin learned Spanish and also learned the local dialect of the Tsutsahila Indians. And Tsutsahila was the language which wasn't even a written language when he went. He learned that. Especially it's a very complicated language. So the guy who couldn't do it, did it. And to talk about the grace of God, there's a sign of things that are coming by that. You know, his abilities were much more than perhaps people gave him credit for. He was associate pastor there until 1975 when he became the pastor. Everybody pretty much left except for him. Missionary work, you know, people have this romantic notion about it, but it's a grind. It's a very difficult lifestyle, and you really have to be called to it. So he had an associate, Father Pedro Bosel. He did most of the work himself. And the parish itself was like 25,000 people because you're talking about the farms, the fincas on the outside of the city. And so he had a lot of work to do, and you saw pictures maybe of him marrying vast amounts of people at one time. Same with baptisms. And a lot of the sacraments were done that way. And he did very well. Matter of fact, he blossomed when he became pastor. His confidence level was high. But the operative word throughout his entire priesthood, and I've heard this from many people who did know him well, was courage. He wasn't afraid of things. He would tackle. And it came from his family background. They were tough German farmers, and that was
farming background.
He had resiliency. He had to learn how to be resilient because you never know what's going to happen with crops. And so I think that was kind of his background, and that's how part of his mettle and a strength of character that he had. And of course, you know, military government became very strong and did not like the fact that he was educating people because they had started a Catholic radio station. He was training catechists to bring the faith out to the faithful in the fincas. Consequently, his name was put on the death list. It was a Benedictine priest who told him he had seen it. So Archbishop Salatka asked him to come home. It was January of 1981. And being obedient, he did. He didn't want to. He wanted to stay. And so he, you know, as his sister Maria told me, sort of moped around for 3 months and wanted to go back. The Bishop of Tulsa at the time, and Tulsa and Oklahoma City had split in 1973. And so the Bishop of Tulsa was Eusebius Beltran and Archbishop Salatka here, and they still worked in tandem with the mission. And Archbishop Salatka was very reticent to send him back, but he asked Bishop Beltran if he would help him talk Archbishop Salatka and let him go back, and he did. And of course Archbishop Beltran, the next Archbishop of Oklahoma City after Salatka, said, you know, I had no idea that was going to happen to him. Obviously I wouldn't have advocated for it. So he went down again in Holy Week of 1981, and supposedly it was safe for him to come back, but the Bishop of Solala said, no, it's not. As you know, probably the rest of the story, he came back one more time in May of 81 for the ordination of his cousin, Don Wolf, who's now the pastor of St. Eugene's here in Oklahoma City. And at that point, a few of his friends said that his goodbyes this time had a finality to them. And so they went back to the mission. Things began to get worse and worse as far as the conditions go. When the military moved into the village, he knew that he was in danger because a lot of people were seeking refuge at the church from the military. And on July 28th, they broke into the rectory. 3 masked men who were obviously Ladinos, taller than the native Tsutsahil, who are shorter by nature, and he was shot twice. And so that's kind of a very brief biography of Stan Rother.
Yeah. It's my understanding those gentlemen were never brought to trial, never caught.
Never caught. They brought 3 people to trial, but they were obviously Tsutsahil because they were short.
Yeah.
And the guys who killed him were Ladinos because they were taller. And strangely enough, the first court found them guilty, but thanks be to God, the Guatemalan Supreme Court overturned it. They overturned the decision and they were set free. We don't know who did it.
Yeah.
I think it's the military.
Yeah. Well, my next question is this, and you kind of touched upon this, and I'd like to expand on this a little bit more. What certain group of people in Guatemala did he serve, and what was his primary mission there? You mentioned some of the vocational things he did. But...
Well, his primary mission was to bring the gospel to people who had not had... You have to understand that in Central America and parts of South America, there had not been resident clergy in these parishes in decades. So when Pope John XXIII in 1962 said, you've got an abundance of clergy, can you help these parishes in Central America especially, the idea was to bring the gospel to these people and to serve them and to have the sacraments available to them, except on, usually before it was on a rare occasion, and to be their pastors and to do whatever it took to help them in their lives, make their lives better, make them better Christians, the same things that a pastor would do here, although because it was such an agrarian area and he had such experience in farming that he also helped them with farming techniques. But his primary mission, first, last, and always, was to be their priest.
Why do you think that area went without a priest for 10 years? Was there political strife or?
It was longer than that. It was decades without a priest. Political strife, there wasn't any homegrown guys going to the seminary to become priests.
Yeah.
And so with our crew that went down there, along with Jude Pancini, who was a Benedictine monk from Conception Seminary, Missouri, they began to get everything going. And we'll talk more about the vocation crisis down there in a minute, but there were 2 really groups of people that he dealt with, those who were Ladinos who spoke Spanish, and the Tsutsahil had their own dialect, like I told you earlier, but Tsutsahil were the poorest of the poor. Something about those people, he was attracted to them even, I think, he served both communities well. But the Tsutsahil had a special place in his heart because they were of such poverty.
Sounds like they really benefited from not just the spiritual aspects, but dealing with agriculture and things like that.
Right,
as well.
Right. Finding ways to make things work better and to be more profitable for the community.
Tell me a little bit more about his martyrdom. What took place immediately after his death? You said these gentlemen came in and
he put up a fight because he did not want to be taken for fear that there would be torture and he might reveal more names of people who were catechists, because his catechists, many of them had been taken out and executed. And so he was trying to deal with that. Well, somebody said, well, he can't be a martyr because he put up a fight. No. He put up a fight because he didn't want them to take him out of there alive. So after he died, the nuns came and basically got the blood off of the floor into vials and made that room a very special place for the people in Guatemala. And his heart, when the community asked that his heart stay in Guatemala, because that's where his heart really was. And the body came back to Okarchi.
Stanley Rother communicated with his family via letters, and one of the correspondence he wrote to his family, "The shepherd cannot run." What did this mean for him and the people he served?
That was a general letter that was in the Sooner Catholic. It was his Christmas letter to the people of Oklahoma. For him, he knew that he was in danger, and he said, shepherd can't run at the first sign of dangers. And so he really truly believed that his vocation was with those people, and that to leave them would be a very undesirable thing for him and for the people that he served. But also, too, he understood that his life was truly in danger, and so, and being obedient, he did come home when Archbishop Salatka asked him to, or told him to. But he truly believed as their shepherd, he needed to be present to them and to serve them, because he had done that so well, and that was his life. When he came back to Oklahoma for that brief time from January to April, there was a lady, I've given talks across the state about Stan Rother, but a lady in McAllister, my hometown, and she came up to me afterwards and she grabbed me and said, you know what? He was here. He gave a talk here in like March of that year. And he told us what was going on down there. And I remember grabbing his arm and saying, don't go back.
Wow.
So everybody I've heard so many stories of memories they have of Father Rother. Another lady came up with her wedding album, and he had celebrated their wedding at St. John's in McAllister and had pictures. So there's all kinds of things like that about him that you hear that I've heard over the years. And so he saw his role as being present, and to be here was totally unacceptable.
Sounds like not only his heart, his happiness, his whole life was there in Guatemala. So I would imagine that would be hard to walk away from.
Yeah.
Stanley Rother has been beatified as Blessed Stanley Rother. Take me through the process, and what does it mean to be beatified?
Well, okay, we started this process in 2007, and actually here's something a lot of people don't know. In 1994, Pope John Paul II was in Guatemala. At that time, the bishops of Central and South America presented a list of martyrs who had died for the faith in those areas for canonization, start the process there. Stan was number 78 on a list of 78. So in order to do this process, you have to have a lot of personnel to do it, and you have to have money to do it, neither of which they had. So in 2007, nothing ever happened with it. Archbishop Beltran got permission from the bishops in Guatemala and said, we really want to start the cause here. Since Archbishop Beltran knew him well personally, it was a really important thing for him to have this happen. So in 2007, he petitioned to the Congregation for the Cause of Saints to start this process. And there was a tribunal set up of different committees and groups and people, and I served on the historical commission, and so our job was to gather anything written by him, to him, or about him. And we had other people who were involved with interviewing eyewitnesses who were still alive at the time. And so this process, we did our other jobs, because we all had other jobs, until about April of 2010, Archbishop Beltran said, I want it done by July.
Well,
he's retiring that, soon. And so he said, because he turned 75 in August of that year. So he said, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you to get it done so we can get it off to Rome. And so we dropped everything else, whatever else we were doing. At that time, I was director of the Office of Family Life. And that's all we did for the next 3 months to get it together. We'd done most of the research. We read through practically everything. And so by the time it was sent off to Rome that year, we had over 7,000 documents that were sent to Rome, and along with eyewitness accounts. Now, so many of those people who gave those testimonies are no longer with us. So I remember Monsignor Weisenberger, now Bishop Weisenberger, classmates together in seminary, known since we were kids. And I said, what do you think? When is this going to happen? He goes, well, I think, we'll probably be in wheelchairs, George, before anything will happen. So for something to happen this rapidly in 10 years is nothing short of amazing when it comes to causes like this. So what happened at that juncture was it went to Rome, 2010. The congregation looked at it and said, okay, yeah, I think there's probably something here. Give us a positio. So the positio was you took all those documents and you kind of shrunk it down into a very large volume so that the people who were going to be looking at it had it readily available to them. So the positio was put together by our person in Rome who was representing our cause, and Dr. Ambrosi was his name. Took a couple of years to get it together. And then in 2014, it was presented to the congregation. In 2015, the Theological Commission for the congregation looked at it and said, I think we have a martyr here. So we had to wait another year till October of 2016. It's normally in October when they announce these things. Of course, it was November, but it's Rome. They do what they want. And so you're looking at all that. And so finally in November, it was announced that, yes, he would be beatified. He'd be made Blessed Stanley Rother, and a part of, the universal church's understanding of sanctity. Beatification is a step right before canonization. Normally, you have to have 2 miracles documented to his intercession in order to be canonized, and 1 for beatification. Since he was a martyr, they waived the miracle, the first miracle. So we had the beatification here. Were you there for that?
I was.
It was spectacular. And it was
amazing.
It really was.
Absolutely amazing.
And that was kind of a gift of Pope Francis to the Universal Church in the sense that before beatifications, took place in Rome as well. But he said, no, now beatifications will take place in the area where the person came from. So that's how we got that to happen here, and it was a phenomenal ceremony and very touching.
Had that happened in America at all before his?
I don't know if there had been one yet before Stan in America. There had been others elsewhere. After that, a month later in Detroit, Stannis Casey's his last name. I can't think of his first name now. Sorry. He was a Franciscan priest. Oddly enough, what was interesting is that Stan Rother had a devotion to him. Because they were simpatico. Because he was like St. John Vianney. People thought, well, and like Stan Rother, because he had sometimes difficulties with studies. that somehow he was not up to snuff. And the same thing with Father Casey. So he had a relic of Father Casey in his personal belongings. And then a month after he was beatified, then he was beatified in Detroit, which I thought was
meant to be, I
yeah,
suppose.
I think so, yeah.
Meant to be.
Yeah.
So you mentioned canonization. What is the process for him to become Saint Stanley Rother?
There has to be a documented miracle attributed to his intercession. That, in other words, there's an obvious attempt to ask him to intercede for a miraculous healing or whatever that might be, and that there has to be documented proof. The doctors would say, well, we thought that there was no way this person could be healed, and they are. We have no logical explanation, whatever it might be. So somebody said, well, yeah, I saw the thing on PBS, and there was the person who talked about that it was through Father Stan's intercession that she was healed. Well, that was before he was beatified. It has to be after his beatification.
You said Rome kind of works on their own timeline. Could you even put a timeline on something like that?
Well, it just depends. I mean, if something does happen and it can be documented and is seen to be truly a miracle, then it could happen anytime. The beatification process takes longer because there's so much to wade through. I mean, the hard part's been done. I mean, they've looked at his life thoroughly, as we all did. And so I feel like I know him pretty well.
I can imagine. I've always thought of Blessed Stanley Rother as someone who has transcended across all faiths, even beyond Catholicism. What greater message or meaning can be taken through the life of Stanley Rother for people of all faiths?
Well, I think that with Blessed Stanley Rother, what always comes first and foremost to me is he was an ordinary guy who did extraordinary things. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's what sanctity is about. The grace of God and the gifts of the Holy Spirit became so much a part of his life and how he led his life that saints, and he will be, I'm sure, at some point. People like Stan Rother give me hope because he had a temper, like the rest of us. He had his shortcomings and failings, but his holiness kind of overrode that ordinariness. But what the beauty of it is that he was an ordinary guy. He was FFA president. He was a guy who worked the soil and was not afraid to get his hands dirty. And he was notorious for going to people's homes for dinner when they asked him to, knowing full well that he probably would get sick by what he ate because of the way things were taken care of. And the food may not have been well prepared. But he wanted to make sure that he was there for them. Sister Marita, his sister, who is a sister, gave us a shirt to the Archdiocese that belonged to him, and it was one of those linen shirts, that you have no collar that you'd use for a rabbi, a collar that a priest would put over it. And I've got several pictures of him wearing a shirt like that. This is probably I know it's one of those. Well, on the inside of it, but it's really hard to display because it's so tattered and worn, there are patches on the inside where he'd repaired the shirt. And Sister Marita said, Stan, I'll give you a shirt. Let me buy you a shirt. I don't need a shirt. I'm fine. Well, she did finally buy him one. It's in the museum, but it's that picture of him that you've seen a million times. And I didn't know that she had given it to him. We just had it in our artifacts. She said, yeah, I gave that to him.
I think that story just kind of speaks to the humbleness of who he was, the hard worker who he was. I teach at the Career Tech system, and I think if Stanley Rother were to walk through the building, he'd be right at home teaching vast amounts of things that he could teach at the Career Tech.
He was a very practical guy who knew how to do many things. He had an old motorcycle that he took apart and put together many times.
Wow, that's really neat.
He was capable of all kinds.
There's a heritage room located on the grounds here of the Archdiocese in Oklahoma City. Can you give me some more detail about this? I've taken a tour with a group of men back in the wintertime. What can you tell us about that?
Well, each year in the past, anyway, we have done a different exhibit. It's kind of about the history of the church in Oklahoma. Well, we knew that in 2016 that this was coming up for Father Rother. Said, now's the time to do Father Rother. And so that's been my baby for about 5 or 6 years. And so my sister-in-law is a graphic designer who's worked for, she was the graphic designer for Prevention magazine. She's a real consummate pro. And so Christina worked on it with me, and I give her the text and the photographs, and she does the rest. And I have to set up the exhibits. Well, we have Mrs. Rother, bless her little heart, never threw anything away. And we have so many things that belong to Father Stan. A guy come through yesterday who went to Mount St. Mary's, and he had a picture from a yearbook with Father Stan wearing that sweatshirt that we're showing in the museum.
Wow.
So it said Mount St. Mary's Seminary on it. And so we have artifacts that are really remarkable that we do have and are able to show. And so it gives you kind of in a microcosm his history, but also things you can see that he wore and touched and were part of him.
If people are wanting to come visit that, you don't have huge marquee signs pointing to that. Where do they need to go, and what are your hours of operation? Do they need
Well,
to
it's
make
open from 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday when the building is open. Or the day before his feast day will be open that afternoon from 1 to 4, I think. And I give special tours for anybody who will call and make an appointment. I've done it on the weekends, nights.
And his feast day is what day?
July 28th.
Coming up.
It's coming up.
A shrine for Stanley Rother is being planned. Can you tell me more about this venture?
It'll be part of the new complex for the very large church, the 2,000-seat church that's being built on the south side. And the museum section of it is part of that whole thing. But his body will be interred in behind the main altar in an apse behind, and it'll be a chapel back there. So it'll be a suitable place for him to be. When he was named for beatification, his body had to be exhumed, and it was taken out of the cemetery at Okarche, and it says in canon law it has to be in a safe place. So it's now in the Resurrection Cemetery Chapel. When the shrine is completed, his body will be there. And the shrine will be, it's unbelievable if you've seen the plans. It's in Spanish mission style with good reason. And there'll be hopefully a museum and a pilgrimage center as well. We're working on the museum plans right now. It's the same, but right now we're talking with people who did Bombing Memorial downtown. The same. Mm-hmm. So hopefully it's going to be spectacular and fitting tribute to a very good man who gave his life in service and knew that sometimes leads to unpleasant things.
Well, lastly, what are some resources, either books or websites, that people can learn more about Blessed Stanley Rother?
Well, the standard resources, of course, would be Maria Scaparlanda's book, The Shepherd Who Didn't Run, and which is a really nice volume to give you a really good idea of who Father Stan was. And it's available. It's our Sunday Visitor Press, and you can get it on Amazon or whatever source you choose very easily. There's also, and we sell them here at the bookstore, I think still, it's Father Monahan's book that he did years ago, and it was the letters of Stan Rother, and it was called The Shepherd Cannot Run. Those two will give you a very good idea. There's other publications that have come out where he is part of a compendium of different saints or people who have given their lives to the faith, but those are the most thorough, those two.
Are there any websites that kind of give updates to the shrine and some readily available?
That would be archokc.org. It's got one section just on Father Rother. And also, too, it will tell you what's going on as far as the shrine goes. It'll give you the newest updates.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk today, and you provided some valuable information that someone that knows nothing about Stanley Rother can appreciate, and those that do know can appreciate him even more. So thank you, sir.
Appreciate You're very welcome.
All right.
My pleasure.
The life and sacrifice of Stanley Rother are certainly inspirational, as well as humbling. No matter your religious affiliation or belief, Rother serves as someone that we can all look up to in order to become human together.